In early spring 1918, deadlock reigned across the Western Front. For more than 3 years, millions of men on all sides have fallen trying to break the stalemate of trench warfare. That struggle would eventually lead both below and above ground, heralding as it did so a new era of warfare and a new type of military icon, the aerial ace. Fighting in single combat in highly unreliable aircraft and freezing conditions, and usually without the benefit of parachutes, it was only the bravest of the brave who took to the skies, where life expectancy was often measured only in hours. The elite of the elite became aces, and were celebrated at home as heroes, though few lived to enjoy that status long. Of all of the aces of the Great War, one man stands out: Manfred Von Richthofen, known as the Red Baron. He too wouldn't live to see the end of the war. This is the incredible story of his final flight. When war was declared in 1914, sustained powered flight was just 11 years old. That said, the possible applications of aircraft in the military had been seen early. But in such a short time, little progress had been made, and the major powers' respective aerial forces were tiny in 1914, with the British Royal Flying Corps heading to France with just 63 aircraft. It would end the war with a total complement of 22,000 across the globe. These first few aircraft were all given similar roles: scouting and reconnaissance. It had been foreseen that an aircraft overflying enemy lines could gather key intelligence such as details of enemy movements, troop concentrations, artillery positions and logistical details in relative safety. In fact, this is exactly what all major powers did in the early months of the Great War. And as movement gave way to stalemate and opposing armies dug in, the need for information grew, resulting in ever more demand for pilots and aircraft. It wasn't long before opposing unarmed aircraft were passing each other in the sky, often at close ranges, and the series of tit-for-tat developments which followed ultimately led to the modern fighter aircraft of today. It worked something like this. A two-man scout aircraft passing another on a given day may do nothing to hinder the operations of the enemy. But before long, the aircraft's observers would begin to bring pistols and rifles into the air and to take pot shots at the enemy and drive them away. The other side, of course, quickly responded, bringing their own weapons, such as shotguns and multiple pistols banked together to provide extra firepower. On the ground, observers and fitters would work together to create mounts for light machine guns, which could be fired at the enemy from an observer's position. Single guns turned into pairs, and before long, aircraft whose purpose was no longer scouting but actually attacking other aircraft were in development. Of course, the slower scouts needed protection, so the other side followed suit, and before long numbers rocketed. Specialist fighter pilots were born, whose main role was to defeat enemy fighters and knock down the far more important enemy scout and reconnaissance planes. Things really changed in mid-1915 when Dutch aircraft designer and pilot Anton Fokker, working with the German government, came up with the famed interrupter gear, itself an improvement on the French deflector gear developed by aerial ace Roland Garros. In short, this device could be synchronized with an aircraft's propeller rotation to allow a machine gun to fire through a spinning prop without the admittedly major disadvantage of destroying your own propeller in the process. In turn, this did away with the need for a second rearward-facing crewman, meaning that a pilot could actually point his aircraft directly at a target and shoot it down. The result was the birth of the true single-seat fighter. Whilst this development was underway, a young German aristocrat from Lower Silesia in modern-day Poland named Freiherr Manfred von Richthofen found himself in an elite, if a little outdated and underused unit. As a nobleman by birth, it had always been expected that young Manfred would go into the military, and the most prestigious branch of it at that, the cavalry. In early 1915, Manfred was an officer in an Ulan cavalry regiment which, although it had seen some action early, was soon after dismounted and relegated to support roles behind the front lines. Frustrated and eager for action, Manfred applied for a transfer and in May 1915 joined No. 69 Squadron of the Imperial German Air Service as an aerial observer, serving in that role for several months. It wasn't until November of that year that young Manfred finally got a chance to pilot an aircraft of his own, training on the Albatros C-3 bomber, which he eventually took into combat against the French and later the Russians, claiming one unofficial aerial victory. Several months later, a chance meeting with German ace Oswald Bohlke changed everything for Richthofen. Always a keen student and possessing instinct honed in the hunt throughout his childhood, Manfred joined Bohlke's new Jagdstaffel or fighter squadron, commonly referred to as a Jasta, learning all he could from the great ace from the moment he first went into action as a fighter pilot during the Battle of the Somme. He adopted and refined Bohlke's tactics and applied his own methods with great success. Over the next 6 months, Richthofen claimed 31 aerial victories with Jastas 2 and 11, including his own 11th victory in which he shot down Major Lano Hawker VC, the famed British ace. Richthofen himself remembered the event.
One day I was blithely flying to give chase when I noticed 3 Englishmen who had apparently gone hunting. I noticed they were flying in my direction, and as I felt much inclination to have a fight, I did not want to disappoint them. I was flying at lower altitude and constantly had to wait, until one of my English friends tried to drop on me. After a short while he came sailing along and wanted to tackle me from the rear. We cycled around and around, like madmen, one after the other, at 10,000 feet. First we cycled 20 times to the left, then 30 times to the right, each trying to get above and behind the other. Soon I realized I was not meeting a beginner. He had not the slightest intention to break off the fight. However, my aircraft was better at climbing at this, and at last I got behind my English waltzing partner. The gallant fellow was full of pluck, and when we got down to 3,000 feet, he merrily waved at me as if he would say, "How do you do?" My Englishman was a good sportsman, but by and by the thing became a little too hot for him, after having endeavored in vain to escape me by looping and such tricks. I followed him down to 500 feet, firing all the time, and the Englishman could not help falling, shot through the head 500 feet behind our line.
It was Manfred's tactical mind and instinct which made him so effective. Singularly determined, but cautious too, he would, wherever possible, only attack when the situation favoured him. It was during these early months that Richthofen developed the habit of having a silver cup made to commemorate each of his aerial victories. He would also often visit crash sites to take souvenirs, and on several occasions met and spoke with surviving aircrew he had shot down. Manfred's fame grew with his victories, and in January 1917 he was awarded the Pour le Mérite, commonly known as the Blue Max, at the same time being promoted to command his own Jasta. Flying alongside him at this time were Ernst Udet, who would go on to senior Luftwaffe command in World War II, and Richthofen's own brother Lothar, himself an accomplished ace. By April 1917, the Battle of Arras was underway, and Richthofen, now a household name in Germany, was in the thick of the fighting. A few months earlier, he had taken the unprecedented step of having his aircraft painted bright red. There is still uncertainty about the reason today. Richthofen's star continued to rise, and throughout bloody April, Jasta 11 achieved a legendary status, with Manfred alone claiming 22 victories in that single month. Shortly afterwards, Manfred was awarded the command of a wing of 3 squadrons, each of which followed their leader's example and painted their aircraft in bright colours. This flying circus, as it became known, was often thrown into areas where the fighting was heaviest, and more than once turned the tide of the air war in that sector. Badly wounded in the head in early July 1917, Richthofen spent some time recovering before returning to action, probably too quickly several weeks later. He claimed a further 6 victories by the end of 1917, bringing his tally to 63, but was again forced to stop flying for several months. Whilst recuperating, Richthofen wrote a memoir of his wartime experiences, which gave an interesting insight into the calculating mind of a hunter.
My former excitement was gone. In such a position, one thinks quite calmly and collectively, weights the probabilities of hitting or being hit. Altogether, the fight is the least exciting part of the business as a rule. He who gets excited in firing is sure to make mistakes. He will never get his enemy down.
By April 1918, German ground forces were finally on the move. On the 21st of March, they had smashed through the Allied lines in the Great Spring Offensive and were desperately trying to split British and French forces around the city of Amiens. Richthofen and his wing were once again in action, flying day after day in support of the offensive. On the morning of the 21st of April 1918, Manfred Von Richthofen left his home aerodrome at Capy, flying a Fokker DR-1 triplane, to begin a sortie westwards along the Somme River. Also flying that day was Manfred's 22-year-old cousin, Wolfram, a novice pilot who had been told to stay clear of any action. Some 25 miles away behind Allied lines at Bertangle Aerodrome, No. 209 Squadron RAF was also getting airborne. Amongst them were Canadian ace Roy Brown and newly arrived pilot Wilfred May. The two men had been old school friends back in Canada, though May, who had much less experience, was very much under the guidance of Brown. Like Richthofen's cousin Wolfram, May too had been told to stay clear of any action and observe. 209 Squadron were at that time flying the famed Sopwith Camel, a highly agile, fast and manoeuvrable biplane mounting twin Vickers machine guns. With very sensitive controls, it was notoriously difficult to handle for novices, but in the hands of a skilled pilot could be a match for anything in the air at that time. At around 11:45 over the village of Les Hamelles, 209 Squadron spotted a group of German Fokker triplanes and attacked them directly. A fierce dogfight erupted as May watched on from above. Several minutes later, May, no doubt frustrated at being relegated to simply observe, saw a single German aircraft apparently doing the same thing. Wolfram von Richthofen. Seizing the opportunity, he set off in pursuit, trying his best to get the enemy aircraft into his crosshairs, not knowing that he too had been spotted. Witnessing this from some distance away, Manfred, in the main dogfight, disengaged and travelled at full speed to the rescue of his cousin. The first May was aware of it was the sound of bullets whipping past his open cockpit. He immediately broke off his own attack and put his aircraft into a barely controlled dive, spiralling down towards the Somme. As May descended, so too, uncharacteristically, did Richthofen, steadily closing on what was to be his 81st victim. As the pair broke through the main melee, they were spotted by Roy Brown, who too disengaged and gave chase. As all three aircraft approached the ground at high speed, with May weaving and Richthofen firing continually, Brown was trying desperately to catch up. With very little altitude left to help him, May began to weave along the River Somme back towards friendly lines, hoping the fear of ground fire would deter Richthofen. It didn't. Just as May had run out of ground and Richthofen, with at least one jam machine gun, closed in, Brown opened up with a burst of 303 fire from his own machine. Richthofen's aircraft was seen to bank steeply and turn to the right close to the brick chimney of a factory, then continue on for a short time before turning 180 degrees and crashing down into a field just north of the River Somme. On the ground, troops rushed to the spot where the red triplane lay smashed. It's been a matter of debate ever since. Some say Richthofen was still alive and mumbled a few words, others that he was unconscious. But what we can be sure is that within a few moments, Manfred von Richthofen, the highest scoring ace of the First World War, was dead. But who fired the fatal shots? It's a question that's been asked ever since that moment in April 1918 and is still hotly debated to this day. Let's look at the evidence. The immediate suggestion at the time, and in fact the official credited kill, was given to Canadian ace Roy Brown, who had dived on Richthofen from directly behind moments before he crashed. He had opened up with a burst of machine gun and was in prime position and certainly had a plausible claim. Brown himself would go and visit Richthofen's body shortly after the action and later left this incredibly powerful account.
The sight of Richthofen as I walked closer gave me a start. He appeared so small to me, so delicate. He looked so friendly. Blonde, silk-soft hair, like that of a child, fell from the broad, high forehead. His face, particularly peaceful, had an expression of gentleness and goodness, of refinement. Suddenly I felt miserable, desperately unhappy, as if I had committed an injustice. With a feeling of shame, a kind of anger against myself moved in my thoughts, that I had forced him to lay there, and in my heart I cursed the force that is devoted to death. I gnashed my teeth, I cursed the war. If I could, I would have gladly brought him back to life, but that is somewhat different than shooting a gun. I could no longer look him in the face. I went away. I did not feel like a victor. There was a lump in my throat. If it had been my dearest friend, I could not have felt greater sorrow.
No doubt Roy Brown's feelings were heartfelt, and clearly the experience had a profound effect on him. But was it he who fired the fatal shot? In recent years, a perhaps more likely possibility has been put forward, that it was in fact ground fire which ended the Red Baron's life. Two main candidates stand out. Either a Vickers gun at the north bank of the River Somme and facing north, manned by Sergeant Cedric Popkin, or anti-aircraft Lewis gunners Bob Buey and Snowy Evans, who were on a low ridge north of the Somme looking east. Now let's combine this with what we know from the medical examination of Richthofen's body shortly after his death. There's some uncertainty here too, as not all post-mortem accounts agree, but it's generally held that the fatal bullet location was found, and that it was a single shot entering on the right side of Richthofen's body, passing through the main chest cavity, hitting the heart and right lung, before exiting slightly higher up at the left breast. This, if correct, strongly suggests ground fire, and in fact effectively rules out Roy Brown, who was shooting from above and directly behind Richthofen. So can anything be gleaned from his aircraft remains? Well, it was pretty heavily souvenired by Australian troops and subjected to enemy shellfire almost immediately after his death. So apart from knowing that Richthofen in his final moments had time to turn off his engine and fuel supply, proving he was at least alive for a few seconds after being hit, the aircraft itself can tell us very little. What we can do though is superimpose the various key positions over Richthofen's flight path in those final moments and examine the evidence. From the many eyewitnesses, we do know that Richthofen was gaining on the inexperienced May along the Somme River in his final few minutes. May decided then to make a treetop level dash for a low ridge to his right, in fact cutting it so close that his wheels touched the ground. We also know that Richthofen followed this route for a time, being shot at by Brown about the same time that he began his right turn. Richthofen passed to the left of Cedric Popkin's position at several hundred yards range, and again past Buey and Evans to their right, all of whom were firing, before hurriedly banking and turning almost 180 degrees close to that factory chimney. His aircraft then reared up and crash-landed in a field south of the main road between the villages of Bray and Corbie. As we can see, the route Richthofen took was closer to Buey and Evans than Popkin, but the bullet entry from the lower right, if to be believed, would be far more likely to have come from Popkin, who was shooting from that angle for quite some time. The truth is, there's no real clear answer as to who was ultimately responsible for shooting down the Red Baron, nor in the grand scheme of things should it really matter. I suppose like any success in the Great War, whether big or small, it almost always comes down to a combination of factors. In short, teamwork. Following his death, Manfred von Richthofen's body was taken to Poulenville Aerodrome before being moved to Bertangles, where he was buried with full military honours on the 22nd of April 1918. Video today exists of the funeral itself, attended by officers and men of the Australian Flying Corps and Australian Infantry. It highlights the esteem in which this enemy combatant was held, both as a pilot and also a worthy adversary. That wasn't the end of the travels for the Red Baron's remains, however. His body was moved no less than 3 times in the post-war years. First in 1920 to Fricourt German Military Cemetery on the Somme, then in 1925 to Berlin's famous Invalidenfriedhof, where bullet damage can still be seen on his headstone, fired by an East German border guard during an attempted escape over the Berlin Wall in the 1970s. And finally in 1975 to his family's home in Wiesbaden, where today he lies in the Richthofen family plot. The story of the Red Baron's life and death has captivated people for more than 100 years, and no doubt will continue to do so long into the future. What certainly shouldn't be overlooked in studying this period of history is the bravery shown by aircrew on all sides. To take to the air in mechanically unreliable machines, often without parachutes, with no guarantee of coming home, and to do so day after day, was and is incredibly brave and fully deserving of our remembrance. So that ends this battle guide video, which we hope you enjoyed and found interesting. Of course, if you'd like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon to keep up to date with our monthly videos. And for the die-hard history fans amongst you, why not check out battleguide.co.uk, where each week we combine the very latest technology and battlefield footage with the world's leading historians to deliver a live virtual tour of some of the world's most spectacular battlefields. So tell us, what do you think? Who do you believe finally ended the Red Baron's remarkable career? No doubt the debate will continue, but we'd love to hear your comments below. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.